Thank you so much for having me. I come really as a humble ally, and I'm really very grateful for you to give me the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm going to try and be as quick as I can. So we spoke a little bit about what Home and Hate does in terms of our work, so some of the monitoring we do of the sources of the worst kind of Islamophobic and far right hate, and we do a lot of tracking of where those really toxic ideas come into the mainstream, either from far-right actors being given mainstream platforms in the media, or from mainstream figures picking up on those ideas. And we see that obviously, particularly right now in the Conservative Party, but across British society. So we track a lot of that kind of thing. And that's just some of the stuff we do. Some of the other things that we do is some of the education work in schools, where we're tackling prejudice and stereotypes. We have a particular workshop I want to mention where we, and this comes back to something Judy said, kind of almost supporting, but in contra, where we actually look at the different way that media represents terrorist attacks, the difference between representation of a far-right terrorist attack and Islamist-inspired terrorist attack, and how one will be straight away jumped on as a terrorist attack, whereas the far right would be as a lone actor or as somebody with mental health issues, and it's all softened by the mainstream media, particularly the right-wing press. So we use that to teach children to think more critically about the kind of information they're getting about bad actors of all sorts, but also just in general for them to understand that, how to think critically about the information they're getting. So I just wanted to mention those couple of things. And I just also, in terms of the mainstream media, this is something I'm supposed to be on the way, be talking about practical things we can do. And I just wanted, some of these are from Hope Not Hate, some of them from external, some of them from my own lived experience as a member of the Orthodox Jewish community, and some of the things the Jewish community does as well. So one thing I wanted to mention also, in terms of the mainstream media, I wanted to give a big heads up to MINAB and his work from the MCB in challenging some of the inaccuracies in the mainstream press. And that can be very hard, slow work to continually challenge and to get things corrected in the mainstream press. Obviously, the corrections are often very small, tucked away, but I think he's really made a difference to the responsibility that newspapers in particular feel, because they know they will get picked up on it if they flagrantly use wrong information about Islam and Muslims. So I think that's a really important structural thing that it's great that is happening. And the more that can happen, the more the mainstream press and media and politicians know that they will be held to account if they're not accurate in the way they report. So I think that's very important. I wanted to talk about challenging tropes and stereotypes. There are always going to be extreme racists who we can't necessarily change how they think about the world. We know from our polling and Hope Not Hate and the data work we've done over more than 10 years, there are a small group of people in this country whose views we can't change, but that most other people, we are able to shift the dial. And I think that in terms of it's very important to remember that there are ways to challenge stereotypes, and thinking about those ways to kind of open up those conversations and say, well, it's interesting that you think that, and let's have a conversation about it whenever and wherever in different ways. And that can be for someone who's out and out expressing racist views and Islamophobic views, if that's something that's happening. But it can also be for those people who are hesitant and fearful, and that's a different kind. It might not ever kind of translate into an Islamophobic attack, but there's a sort of a fear and a hesitancy there that is kind of ripe for a conversation and for kind of a positive engagement. I wanted to also mention that obviously when we're talking about Islamophobia, it's also, and other people have said this better than me tonight, but it's incredibly important to support the victims themselves, allowing them to have that time and that space to share their stories and to support them. And I also wanted to say, in terms of that, some of the stories we've heard tonight about when things are being reported, we should know that there's an Islamophobic response if they're not listened to by the person they're reporting to or by the authority they're reporting to. So again, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think it's important to know not just that if the attack is awful, the attack is awful, but if you're not listened to when you go and tell someone about it, or the response is to trivialize it when you want to speak to somebody about it, that in itself is Islamophobic too. So we shouldn't forget that too. In terms of what, as a, how do we do this together? I think it's really important that we don't always have to some things are more important than do we agree on all the minutiae of how we live our lives. So I think from the Jewish community, this is particularly important in terms of tackling anti-Semitism. Some things are so big that we're all impacted by them. So, you know, you might have different denominations, people who don't necessarily want to pray in each other's synagogues for religious reasons or for, you know, structural reasons. But when it comes to tackling anti-Semitism, we work together across denominations. And I think that that's you know, it's hard. The Jewish community is much easier because it's much smaller and geographically it's much tighter. It's in smaller areas, although obviously there are Jews all over Britain. It's a much smaller number, and the organised Jewish community is much more limited geographically. But the idea that some things are too important to get lost in the details, you know, sometimes we just have to park the difference of, you know, how religious we are or how this and that we are, and go, let's just park that, because we've got to come together, because this is something we need to crack. This is impacting all of us. And I think that's something the Jewish community has worked very well on. And I think, you know, that again, I think that's something that in terms of the Muslim community will make a big difference, and can make a real change. And it can be so, and I say this from my own experience, not from anything I've observed from Muslim friends, but it's so destructive to get lost in the details and to talk, you know, to talk about the little things that you don't agree on when you actually try to make positive change. So I just wanted to talk about institutional Islamophobia as well. And this is possibly, you know, more of a structural, and maybe this is for Muslim organizations rather than individuals who are experiencing Islamophobia to think about. So when we talked about the Jewish community's submission to the EHRC on Labour anti-Semitism, what worked there was reporting where the structures were letting down individual Jews rather than individual instances. So in other words, if somebody experiences Islamophobia, as I was saying before with the reporting, let's say you report it to your local police and you get a bad response. The structural Islamophobia behind the fact that the police force is not well trained is something that's trackable and fixable, because that you can't necessarily stop the racists attacking you in the street, but what you can do as a community is say, this was the response, we've noted this, and you as an organization or as an institution, whether it's an academic institution or a workplace, you have a responsibility to fix this. And this is something that I think we again, it's very important to support the victims of individual Islamophobic incidences, but when you're looking at structural Islamophobia, it's very important to track where the system isn't working or isn't being well supported, or people are not being trained, or the reporting systems are not in place that should be there. And I think time spent looking at that can be very useful. And I think that in terms of what I heard back from the EHRC submissions was that the things which were useful were the things which showed the patterns where people were being let down. And I think that's quite a useful piece of learning. I just also wanted to mention, we mentioned already schools, we mentioned geography, but also, you know, the presentation of Muslims in the media and in children's books and stuff like that. I think we're on an upward trajectory there. Anjali Rauf's books are great. There are other children's books which are fantastic. The more we can get mainstream Muslim representation in school libraries or on TV and stuff, the better. And I think, again, that diversity, like, and not getting lost in the details, or I didn't really like the way they represented. Positive presentations are positive presentations, even if they don't exactly reflect what happens in your mosque or in your home. And I think that, you know, the more we can encourage that, again, it's that kind of counterfactual. For not everybody in Britain lives in an area where they might necessarily meet and interact with Muslims. I mean, I'm lucky, I live in London and I do. But if, you know, my brother lives in Devon, I have conversations with him about his children and how he is going to introduce them, you know, to diversity. There's very, very little diversity where he lives. So children's books and TV is a great way of doing that. And my final thing I just wanted to say is, you know, Julie, we talked about like not kind of doing the framing on victimhood. And I think this, again, a learning for me personally, that I think the Jewish community also can do that a lot. We can get caught very much up in anti-Semitism. And it's not that it's not a problem, of course it is. When Jews first moved to America, in large numbers to escape what was happening in Nazi Germany, the Orthodox Jews would often they would get a job on a Sunday, and then they couldn't work on a Saturday, so they would lose their job on the Friday because of the Sabbath. And there was a phrase in Yiddish that people used to say, it's hard to be a Jew. And a whole generation of Jewish children heard their families finding Judaism hard. And that had an impact in terms of assimilation, a huge impact in terms of assimilation. And I think the Jewish community realised over time that you have to celebrate your identity, particularly for your children. You have to find, and this has been said much more articulately by the Muslim speakers than I could myself, but finding the joy in the fact that we are British Jews or British Muslims is so important, because that's what sustains us, it's what sustains our family, it's what makes our children excited by their identity. And I think, you know, there's a song actually now that kids, that it's like I don't know how, it's like an Orthodox Jewish pop song, if you want to call it that, and it's also in Yiddish, and it's about how it's great to be a Jew. And you know, that kind of like, and they dance to it. I mean, don't ask, it's, yeah, but it's great, right? And that's what we need. We need that sense of positivity and celebration, because we are in battle. The Muslim community is having a really tough time. But you know, being a British Muslim should be great, can be great. I know from my British Muslim friends, it is great. And so let's, you know, I think it's really important to celebrate the positives.